In this session, we'll look at this portfolio's credit risk, the credit risk involved with a portfolio, or when I'm talking about a portfolio of credits, what is the risk involved with it? So, typically, whenever we talk about analyzing the risk in any credit portfolios, we are looking at various elements. We have been talking about any kind of credit risk. We talk about probability of default, the loss given default. We talk about what is the probability of fall in ratings, degradation of the credit ratings, right? So all these things do come up even when we are evaluating individual securities. But when I am looking at credit risk in a portfolio framework, apart from all these things, I am also looking at, okay, let's say this is one obliger and this is the other obliger. Probably it's like borrower 1, borrower 2 and borrower 3. I have created these three borrower, uh, these three lending securities, or these three instruments, I have merged them into a portfolio, right? Because I have provided the loans to three borrowers and I am looking at the overall risk in a portfolio framework. So that is where I am observing the portfolio credit risk. Now, identifying the probability of default, the loss given default, and all these things for individual positions is more or less fine. But when we look at it in this grouped kind of a framework, we are also looking at the correlation. We also have to look at the relationship between a pair of the credits, right? I have to look out for the relation between B1 and B2 with respect to default. Like if B1 defaults, what is the probability that B2 will default? Are these two defaults completely independent, or is there any close resemblance? Probably if B1 is defaulted, does it mean that B2 also is going to default quite in no time? All these things have to be understood, and that is where we are trying to measure this default correlation. It's a measure talking about what is the probability of multiple defaults in this portfolio. What is the probability of multiple defaults occurring at a point in time itself? So for that, the simple way, probably if I start off with a two credit kind of a portfolio, right? Probably the two firm credit portfolio, if I am seeing, let's assume individually that the probability of default, for the first firm is pi 1 during a particular period of time. The probability of default for the second firm, let me assume it as pi 2. Then the probability of default of first and the second firms, both the firms defaulting, I can take it as pi 1 2, means the firms which of them are both defaulting, which means now, yeah, overall the firm D1 if defaulting, the firm 1 defaulting is pi 1, but along with the firm 2 defaulting is pi 1 2. Means if I want to know the probability of D1 alone, the firm D1 alone defaulting, I can write it as pi 1 minus pi 1 2. Similarly, the probability of D2 alone defaulting, second firm alone defaulting, it is pi 2 minus pi 1 2, and both firm 1 and firm 2 defaulting, as we have seen, it is pi 1 2, and so the probability that none of the two are defaulting, probably 1 minus of all these things, because at least one firm defaulting from here is coming when I am adding all these, coming out to pi 1 plus pi 2 minus pi 1 2. So at least one firm defaulting probability is this. So the probability that none of the firms are defaulting, coming out as 1 minus pi 1 minus pi 2 plus pi 1 2. So the same, it can very well be viewed through this kind of a mechanism, trying to work out with the probabilities of default for each. But now you see, if I take the same into a three firm framework, right? Two firm framework, probably I require four different probabilities here. But look at a three firm framework. Okay, the probability of default for the first firm, pi 1. Probability of default for the second firm, pi 2. Probability of default for the third, pi 3. First and second, right? Probability of default for the first and second, pi 1 2. Probability of default for second and third, you'll find so many combinations that have to be found out, pi 1 3. Then similarly, I'm talking about all three firms defaulting. Probability of D1 and D2 and D3, pi 1 2 3. And now if I want to talk about probability of D1 alone, D2 alone, now there is a huge effort that is going in, and overall we will end up with finding out 8 different probabilities, which is nothing but 2 cube. Here we had 2 squared, 4 different probabilities coming up because it's a 2 firm. Here we'll have 3 firms, so it will go to 2 cube, 8 different probabilities. And probably if I have a 10 firm scenario, probably I may end up computing 2 per 10 calculations of probabilities of defaults pairwise, which becomes a very tedious kind of an exercise. So that's the reason this is one of the major limitations of this kind of a framework. Alright, now again moving further. So once we know these probabilities, now we can think of the means, right? Because it is estimated, all these are going as a simple Bernoulli trace because either default or not default. So these all can be treated as simple Bernoulli trails itself. So probability that at least one of the firms is defaulting is this much, and the probability that none of the firms is defaulting is going to be this much. Now looking at a few more calculations, what is the expected value of the default of each firm? Expected value of default of each firm is nothing but pi I, and the variance of default for each firm comes out as expected xi squared minus expected value of xi whole squared. Now even this is pi minus pi squared. So the variance will come out as pi into 1 minus pi. We know that from a Bernoulli distribution we can say if the mean is pi, the variance is going to be pi I into 1 minus pi I, right? So that is the same logic which I am applying here. So this is the variance. And what about the covariance between any two pairs? Covariance between x1 and x2 means two firms, the covariance between the two firms defaulting simultaneously, which is nothing but expectation of x1 x2 minus expectation of x1 into expectation of x2. So both the firms expectation is nothing but pi 1 2 minus pi 1 times pi 2. So from here I can derive correlation between the two defaults x1 and x2. I can write it as covariance divided by the standard deviation of the first one into the standard deviation of the second one. So this is how we compute the default correlation between two sets of credit positions. If I want to find out the default correlation between them, this is the mechanism to find out. But however, as I have already hinted, that there are a few drawbacks going with this framework. The first of them, I have already hinted, the number of calculations that are required to be made is very high, especially if the number of positions increases. For 10 positions, I require 2 power 10 probabilities to be computed, because we are talking about individual. So each pair of default, as I talked about in a three pair or three firm framework, three individual firm defaults I require. Pairwise, only two firms defaulting, any two firms, AB, AC, BC, two firms defaulting, I require that. All three firms require defaulting, I require a probability, and none of the firms defaulting, I require a probability. So basically, there will be too many calculations involved, and that is one of the prime reasons this model will have its own drawbacks. And this model is quite simpler, right? It's just finding out the correlation between the two sets of it's only time taking and effort intensive, but the framework is very simple. So the framework is simple. What does that mean? Some kind of special credit positions, probably something involving guarantees or any kind of revolving credit arrangements that are there, any other contingent liabilities present, which are more like option like features. Any option like features like convertible bonds, credit default swaps, they cannot be modeled into this framework. Probably you remember this one single word. It can help you solve all these come only under that particular framework. Option like features means only on contingency, only on occurrence of some event. So it's not a guaranteed kind of a payoff, only subjected to some constraint the payoff happen. So that is where we talk about option like features, and this framework cannot accommodate the instruments which are having option like kind of features. And the major thing for the not so popularity of the default correlation based framework, right, primarily is the data availability. See, the data availability, generally the defaults occurrence is very rare, right? Generally the firms don't keep defaulting or probably big set of firms don't keep defaulting every time. So it's a very rare event. So probably even if I have to build some kind of a model around it, I have to observe the firms over a very long period of time. So generally having more data, and that too because the probability of one firm defaulting itself is very low. Looking at a joint default, right, probability of two or more firms defaulting together within a same time frame, that probability will be even more lower. So any small variation in terms of capturing the data and tabulating it will have a very significant influence in the decisions. That's one of the prime reasons the correlation based credit portfolio framework is having its limitations with respect to evaluating the credit portfolios. However, the default correlations help us understand at least what is the kind of association that each of the positions have as a part of my overall portfolio framework. Is it well diversified, or am I exposed more and more to this risk? Right? So, understanding the credit portfolio framework and the drawbacks associated, correlation based credit portfolio framework and the drawbacks associated with this is very important. Now let's move on to our next important concept, looking at the credit VAR, credit value at risk. So just as a quick recap, whenever I am interested in finding out the credit VAR, I require expected loss as well as the unexpected loss. And just to remind, right, when I'm looking at a distribution, if this is my expected loss, which is typically found out using the probability of default and loss given default along with the exposure at default, right? So using these things we are trying to measure the expected loss, and of course when I talk about a portfolio along with the probability of default of the individual positions or firms or credits, I am also talking about the default correlation that is existing between the various pairs, which will help me in the default correlation is something which we would also consider in case of a portfolio. But for the expected loss computation, I all require is the probability of default multiplied with the loss given default. But when it comes to a portfolio, when we are talking about or probably even for a single security also, this is the unexpected loss, and the unexpected over the expected is what we have defined as credit value at risk, right? Now based on this, when I am talking about the default correlation between two different credits, when I talk about default correlation between two different credits, now if the correlation between them is 1, they are perfectly correlated, means no diversification benefit. So it's as good as one single security itself and one single position itself. So if it is one single position, there is no reduction in the credit VAR because the volatility does not come down, the variance does not come down, and the variance does not come down means probably the VAR is not coming down because this is not coming down. But when I talk about default correlation less than 1, or probably it's going more closer to 0. What could very well happen is this can come down towards this side. So probably the same can come somewhere here, making the credit VAR more to be a lesser number. So because when the default correlation is 0, they are behaving as if they are independent. And if they are independent, probably I can very well use the binomial distribution, because the binomial distribution assumes that each of the variables are independent. So because there is no correlation that is existing between the two different firms or two different credits, the portfolio is behaving like a binomial distributed random variable itself. And obviously you will find some level of diversification benefit, which means the credit VAR can quite comfortably come down. So just to talk about it, the expected loss will not change because of default correlation, because the default correlation is playing a role more with the volatility or the variance part of it. So the unexpected loss will actually come down because of the diversification benefit, or because of a default correlation less than 1. So that will impact the credit VAR, and it could reduce our credit VAR quite drastically. And one more thing that we are talking of is, apart from the lesser default correlation. So basically one point that we are saying is the default correlations, if they are lesser, then if they are lesser in my portfolio pairwise default correlations, if they are much lesser, there are some kind of diversification benefits, means my overall credit VAR is directly coming down, right? Now on the other side, if I'm having more positions in the portfolio, as the positions in the portfolio increases, also the diversification benefit increases. So instead of having 50 different credit portfolios, if I maintain 500 different credit portfolios or different credits in the portfolio, that directly adds up to my diversification benefit, and the CVAR, the credit VAR, will still come down. But of course, mind you there, if the original default correlations, or if the original default probabilities are much lesser, and probably each individual probability of default, if it is going much lesser, even if you are making it more and more granular by adding more and more credits to the portfolio, there may not be a significant reduction in our portfolio VAR. So but in general terms, the more granular the portfolio is, when I say granular, I am talking about having more number of firms in the portfolio, it will automatically reduce the credit VAR of the portfolio. But at the same time, if the individual probabilities of default are already much lesser, the extra reduction that comes by increasing the number of credits into the portfolio is not that significant. So when we talk about very large credit portfolios having more number of firms or credits in it, various large number of credit positions packaged together to a large portfolio, in some cases, especially if the probabilities of the default are much lesser, you will not find that the credit VAR is anything significant, right? So that is one benefit that you get looking at the default correlations and the number of credits to be included in the portfolio. You can very well reduce your credit VAR quite drastically. Alright. Now we will try going ahead with a single factor model, the another mechanism. We'll try to understand a single factor model and try to see how it helps us in credit portfolio risk. In a single factor model, we try to associate the following relationship. Let me first write down the expression. AI is equal to beta I times M plus square root of 1 minus beta I squared times epsilon I. What does that mean here? We are trying to link the returns of each asset, right? We are trying to find a relation. Returns of each asset, we are trying to link it with a market factor, right? Market return, we are saying that beta I is the correlation that is associated with the market. So if beta I is the correlation that is associated with the market, then square root of 1 minus beta squared, because at the square level the summation should be equal to 1. Beta I squared plus 1 minus beta I squared actually is making it equal to 1. So that's where if beta I is the if beta I is the correlation with respect to the market, then we are talking about square root of 1 minus beta I squared is the standard deviation with respect to the idiosyncratic risk. So this is with respect to market risk and this is with respect to idiosyncratic risk. So whatever is the company specific or firm specific or idiosyncratic risk, what is the standard deviation associated with that? The standard deviation associated with the market is coming out as beta I, then which is associated with its own is square root of 1 minus beta I squared. Now these are the individual idiosyncratic shocks, which is company specific kind of movement. Then one more thing is we are assuming that the firm specific returns are independent of each other. So no two credits, no two firms have returns dependent on each other. So whenever we are talking about the correlation between the two pairs, because of the independence, the correlation between between the two pairs of individual asset returns always will become beta I times beta j itself, because they are independent. Their correlations are nothing but the product of their individual correlation. And at the same time, we are saying in this model, any firm will default if as long as the AI is less than or equal to some threshold value Ki. As long as the asset returns are more than a threshold, the firm is not going to default. But the moment when the asset returns are going lesser than this Ki, which is a threshold value, the moment this AI goes below the threshold, and the threshold we are defining as the logarithmic distance. The threshold is generally defined as the logarithmic distance to the default asset value. The logarithmic distance to the default asset value measured in terms of the standard deviation, means number of standard deviations away from the default asset value. So whatever is the threshold which we are defining, corresponding to this threshold, what is that number of standard deviation that your asset value is away from. So if it is compared to compared to this, if the defaulted asset value is let's say 2 standard deviations lesser or 3 standard deviations lesser, depending on the threshold that we are defining, we'll say that the firm is defaulting or non-defaulting. One of the major assumptions that goes, or one of the major positives that grows as a part of this model, is the conditional independence. See, here we have linked the asset returns AI, right? We have linked the asset returns AI with the market M. So once that realization happens, we are making an assumption that the defaults are independent of each other. Once I have linked with the market, see the point is, once I have linked the asset returns with the market, whatever is the remaining portion, it is purely idiosyncratic, which is purely company specific, and each of the idiosyncratic shocks are independent to each other. Because everything is, we are linking to any kind of a dependency, we are trying to link it with the market factor. So that is where we are able to use this model to estimate the portfolio's credit risk. And all we do in that model is, we have said AI is beta I times M plus square root of 1 minus beta I squared times sigma I, epsilon I. Now, assume some specific number for the market, right? Assume some specific factor value for the market. So, probably if I am doing AI minus beta IM based on that assumption of the market value. This is nothing but square root of 1 minus beta I squared epsilon I, where this epsilon I is more and more of company specific and it is a random parameter. And what we are seeing is the other side, AI minus beta IM, it is the distance. AI is the single asset return, beta IM is my expected asset return. This is an actual asset return. This is my expected asset return. So the difference of that is giving me as a distance to default. The difference between them is what is giving me the distance to default. So it can either increase or decrease based on this particular parameter. So depending on how this company specific contribution to the returns is increasing, either the overall asset returns is either increasing or decreasing. So because of this kind of conditional independence, we are talking about so when I define, let's say, some kind of a threshold, the threshold may not change for me, but the standard deviation, see, initially the standard deviation was taken as 1 when we are talking about unconditional. But when I have conditioned it on the market, when I have conditioned the same on the market, the standard deviation associated with the idiosyncratic shock has come out to square root of 1 minus beta I squared. So in the unconditional default distribution, we had a standard deviation of 1, whereas in the conditional default distribution, we had a standard deviation of only 1 minus square root of 1 minus beta squared. and at the same time the mean also got shifted. In the earlier case, in the unconditional, the mean was taken as 0, whereas for the conditional default distribution, we are taking the mean as beta I times m. See, earlier when I looked at anything that is negative probably is coming out as the default itself. But now I am trying to compare it with a benchmark which is beta I times m. So here the mean is being considered as beta I times m. Anything that is below that is treated as the default. So now we are assuming that the conditional distribution of default is following a normal distribution with mean, probably one more important point for us here, with the mean beta I times m and a standard deviation square root of 1 minus beta I squared. So this is the conditional default distribution conditioned on the market. Whereas the unconditional default distribution, we have taken it as a standard normal distribution itself, means mean equal to 0 and standard deviation equal to 1. Now based on this, I have to specify some value for m, right? I have to specify some value for the market parameter, and based on that value that is defined for the market parameter, I will get get the distance to default either higher or lower. Now from here what we could notice is the conditional probability of default is either greater than or less than the unconditional probability of default, because for us now the probability of default is working out as some threshold value, right, minus, because it's a normal distribution, I am finding out the probability of default is some threshold value minus beta I times some specified value of m divided by the standard deviation 1 minus beta I squared. Now depending on if m is 0, then probably this entire thing, if m is 0, then the conditional probability may be the same as unconditional itself, or even if beta I is 0. So as long as the m or beta I are not going to be 0, the conditional probability of default will be either higher or lower than the unconditional probability of default. And we have seen that the standard deviation in case of conditional is square root of 1 minus beta I squared, whereas the standard deviation in case of unconditional is 1. So from here, let's say if I have some kind of, so let's say for a particular asset or for a particular firm, having some amount of beta, if beta is known for that particular firm, and a threshold is being set for it. We know the threshold value associated with it, and the threshold generally, as we have said, it is measured in terms of number of standard deviations. Threshold is generally set in terms of number of standard deviations from this. So the moment I know the threshold value, from there I can find out the z value corresponding to the normal distribution variate, and probably if someone has set the market value factor also, then based on this I can very well find out the conditional variance, right, because all the other numbers are present. I can very well find out the conditional cumulative default probability, which can come out as this itself, the conditional cumulative default probability. For me, if I want cumulative, I'll take it as the overall this particular function itself. So if I know, let's say my beta is 0.3, and if I know that the default threshold ki, let's say, is minus 2.33, So based on this, I can very well find out my unconditional probability of default first without considering this and this. So unconditional probability of default will become phi of ki, which is nothing but phi of minus 2.33, which is 1%. The unconditional probability of default is coming out to be 1%. But now if I want to look out for conditional, okay, assuming let's say the market return, if the market return is let's say minus 0.4, right, what is the conditional? Now if at all I want to look out for the conditional. Now in this conditional distribution I have what is the mean here? In the unconditional I was taking this as 0 and this as 1. But here in the conditional it is becoming okay minus 2.33 minus what is the beta I times m. Beta I have taken as 0.3 and the market return I have taken it as minus 0.4. So probably it is becoming minus of so I am taking it as minus of minus 0.12 minus of minus 0.12 and this I am dividing by square root of 1 minus 0.09. So this is coming out now when I am looking at phi of this minus 2.33 plus 0.12. So it is coming out as pi of minus 2.21 divided by square root of 0.91. Correct? So whatever is this now conditional probability of default I can get through this pi of minus 2.21 divided by square root of 0.91 will give me the conditional probability of default. So this is how we change from an unconditional probability of default to a conditional probability of default. So the mean in this new case is the new distance to default. So based on the realized market factor beta 1 beta I m and standard deviation is based on square root of 1 minus beta I squared. So basically for us the most important point to understand here is the probability of default is based on the distance of the new default trigger of idiosyncratic shocks measured in terms of standard deviation below its mean. So I can very well compute the same. So taking the new beta I m and the new standard deviation square root of 1 minus beta I squared, I'm getting this kind of a value which will give me the conditional default probability. Let's see what it is going to come out in this case. Pi of minus 2.21 divided by square root of 0.91. So minus 2.21 divided by square root of 0.91 is working out to minus 2.31 and probably I am considering the norm inverse for the same. It is giving me okay saying norms test okay taking this minus 0.2231 minus 2.31 it's saying me 1.02%. In this case the probability of default has gone up slightly. Earlier when it was minus 2 point unconditional probability of default has been 1 whereas the conditional probability of default now is 1.03. Now here itself if I make a small modification saying the market return is not minus 0.4, probably if I am making the market return is minus 0.2, rest all remaining the same. So this becomes minus of 0.06. So minus 2.33 plus 0.06 becoming minus 2.27. So what is happening here? If it has become minus 2.27, obviously the probability, conditional probability of default is going lesser than the unconditional probability of default. That is what I was telling you earlier. The conditional probability of default will be either greater or smaller than the unconditional probability of default. As long as M bar, which is the market return, and the beta, both of them are not equal to 0, there will be sometimes higher, there will be sometimes lower conditional probability of default based on how it is associated with the market factor, right? So this is one of the important mechanisms for us to estimate the credit risk involved in a portfolio, the portfolio credit risk model. We would also see the relationship between the default correlations among the firms and their single factor beta parameter. Let's see how we look into that particular aspect. The next important thing in this context for us is trying to find out the credit VAR using a Copula mechanism. So what we can very well do is using the mechanism of simulation based on a Copula function. So generally I can define one Copula function, and generally for credit VAR estimation model we go with a normal Copula only. Normally distributed Gaussian Copula function is the one that is generally used. So probably based on that Copula function, we generate some thousands of values. So I can simulate the various default times. So probably I can simulate for the first asset and the second asset separately, right? So I can separate some few thousands of simulations based on the Copula for the first first asset in the portfolio, and similarly for the second asset in the portfolio, and then whatever the simulated values that have come, I'm trying to map those simulated values to the standard univariate normal quantile, assuming that these are not two different variables. Whatever the joint function that has come, I am trying to map it to a standard univariate normal quantile, which means even though if this is a 2000 values, if this is 2000, overall there are 4000 values, I am trying to map them to a standard univariate normal quantile, which means I am actually getting only 2000 pairs of probability values. And out of this 2000 pairs, probably the first one I am trying to map to the first asset, and the second one I am trying to map to the second asset. And based on that, I'll try to obtain the market values. So once I have these values, I can get the terminal market values. Otherwise, we call them as terminal values. I'll try to get the terminal market values for each of these pairs. For each of this, for each of these asset classes, I'll try to get the terminal market values, and after that, I'm simply adding up. And from where I could very well get up what is the terminal value associated with the first asset, and what is the loss incurred with it, what is the terminal value of the second, and what is the loss incurred with it. So once I get the market values and compute the profit and loss data for each scenario, based on the simulated default types, and after that I can get into a portfolio distribution by adding the simulated terminal values. So I can very well talk about four different scenarios that get computed. The first asset defaulting, what is the terminal value and what is the loss. The second asset defaulting, what is the terminal value, what is the loss. Both the assets defaulting, what is the terminal value, what is the loss. And no asset defaulting, obviously there is no loss. So what is the terminal value? Based on that, I should be able to compute the credit VAR, especially with this Copula kind of a function. So these are some of the mechanisms that are available to evaluate and compute the portfolio credit risk. If you have any further queries regarding the same, you can very well get back to me by giving me a call on the number that I have provided below, or you can send in an email at vamsidhar@pacegurus.com. Thanks a lot for listening to this session. Thank you very much.